Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another one of these Military Aviation Museum webinars. Of course, the museum is closed to the public currently, but we have been really excited to be able to offer these great webinars with guest speakers featured from across the warbirding community to lecture to us and share stories of really interesting subject matter connected to both World War I and World War II aviation. Really excited tonight to have Chad Hill of Django Studios here with us. But before I begin introducing Chad, I just wanted to provide a couple housekeeping notes for folks who may be new to our webinar programming. Tonight's webinar will feature partial nudity. It is through original images from World War II depicting nose art and pinup girls. So we just wanted to make everyone aware of that before we get into the presentation. Tonight you will also find a couple of links in the chat window, the first of which will be a link to Django Studios, Chad's website. So if you want to find out more about his design portfolio and some of the amazing work he's done, you'll be able to access it there. We will also be including a link that will allow you to donate to the Military Aviation Museum as a way to continue to support the free delivery of this incredible assortment of webinar subjects and guest speakers. So, tonight's subject is something very near and dear to my heart, as I used to work at the Commemorative Air Force and managed the world's largest surviving collection of World War II nose art recovered from Walnut Ridge in Arkansas. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Chad Hill, proprietor of Django Studios and nose artist extraordinaire, to take us on a journey tonight exploring the significance and history of this unique art form in aviation. Chad, take it away.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I want to thank Keegan and everybody for giving me the opportunity to do this. And I'm excited to share some of these stories with you and go over some of the history at the nose art. And yeah, it's going to be a good time. So to get started, nose art was done in World War II as a way to personalize the aircraft, and it really boosted the morale of the soldiers. It could be something about the girl that they missed at home, or the girl they missed from last night, or that they just missed girls, period. You guys were young in their early 20s, so maybe they portrayed a favorite song or a comic book on the plane, but it really helped to build a bond between the air crews and the ground crews, and it really gave everyone a sense of togetherness and what they were going through. It gave them an identity on the airfields. And it really gives us a personal connection to the daily lives of these young men who fought in the skies of World War II. And that's why nose art is important. It lets us see some of the history beyond just the aircraft serial numbers and the mission logs and the statistics. We get to see into what life was like for them through popular expression and folk art. And it really lets us get a glimpse into that time period that most of us didn't live through. And it's important to preserve and celebrate these stories and artwork so that we can continue to tell the story of the greatest generation and World War II, and to make sure that their stories are not forgotten. So again, my name is Chad Hill. How did I get here? Well, my mom taught me how to draw at a young age. I would draw airplanes and cars and tractors. She really worked with me to help me hone that skill and become a better artist. Meanwhile, my dad and my uncle took me to my first air show in 1977, and I was hooked. I was really enamored with the then Confederate Air Force, and they bought me 2 of the air show programs, which I still have today. And I would just look at those for hours, over and over, just reading about every airplane that I could, and just soaking as much of the information as I could. And from there, I built models. I built models for 4-H and took some to the state fair. It was, I really enjoyed building the models because you study the aircraft and see all the names and the artwork on it and the history, and watching the war movies every Sunday with my dad. They played them every Sunday, and that was always fun. So I ended up going to school to be a graphic designer, and I graduated from Ball State University in 1993. And from there, my interest in World War II kind of went dormant. I didn't really focus on that as much because I had just gotten out of college. I had a job. I worked downtown Chicago designing packaging for Hasbro and Unilever. So I worked on a lot of brands that you're familiar with, like Trivial Pursuit, Monopoly, Spider-Man, some Star Wars stuff. For Unilever, I worked on Suave, Suave Kids, Degree Perspirant, Salon Selectives. I worked on the very first Suave Kids when it came out. So you've probably all seen that if you have kids. So I did that for 19 years, and in 2012, I started Django Studios. My boss had passed away from cancer, and I was kind of left wondering what to do. And through encouragement of friends, I decided to open up Django Studios. And my focus primarily is on aviation and the automotive aftermarket. So now I do work for the Commemorative Air Force, the Collins Foundation, the American Air Power Museum, EAA, Warbirds in Review, the Liberty Foundation, Night Fright, Vintage Wings, Air Corps Aviation, Midwest Aero Restorations, and many more. And on the corporate side, I do work with Snap-on Tools, Peak Antifreeze, Smithfield Foods, Richard Petty Motorsports, Stuart Haas Racing, and Stuart Warner Gauges. And if you're mechanically minded, if you see the Snap-on 100th anniversary logo, I worked on that. It's starting to pop up everywhere now, which is kind of fun. I do all kinds of design work. I do air show graphics, exhibit graphics, logos, patch design, apparel design. This is an example of some of my illustration. Let's go through some quick examples. There we go. Sorry about that. These are some logos that I've done. I do some patchwork. These are leather patches for the Collins Foundation. That's one of my Django Studios embroidered patches. This is some of my t-shirt work that I do for the Commemorative Air Force and for the American Air Power Museum. More CAF work. The Wings Over Dallas Air Show. I've been doing that artwork for a few years now. Placid Lassie, I did the t-shirt art for that and the D-Day Squadron artwork and marketing materials, which was a fun project. And Night Fright and Neil Pub. I also do illustration that's a little bit more in depth than the flat color. This one was one of Lope's Hope that was done for the Dakota Territories Museum. And it was a really fun project. And this piece was actually submitted to the Air and Space Museum, which is crazy to think about. And I'm really honored for that. And this is an old crow illustration that I did for Warbirds in Review. You can see it's signed there by Bud Anderson. I do event graphics. I did this trailer design for the Liberty Foundation. And for Snap-on, for their Veterans Conference, I did this large-scale B-29 and designed special commemorative nose art for that. And that was about 9 or 10 feet tall, so it was pretty big. And that brings us to the nose art. So World War I is when nose art was first spotted on an airplane, since that's when airplanes really got a real foothold in military combat. The first known nose art was in 1913 when an Italian amphibious plane was seen sporting a sea monster on its fuselage. Here's some examples. All the countries ended up having them. The Germans, Italians, the French, the Americans. And a lot of it was squadron-based art. Here's some really interesting paintings. The jazz bow and the flying fish. You can see how they're painted up like fish, and the jazz bow even has a shark mouth. Can you imagine what these must have looked like in color? It would be pretty amazing. And that, of course, brings us to Eddie Rickenbacker in The Hat and the Ring, probably the most famous aviator of all time. And actually, there's a piece of a 94th Aero Squadron plane in the Air and Space Museum. It was piloted by Harvey Cook, who was from Indiana, from Hancock County, which is where my great-grandparents lived. And Indianapolis Airport, International Airport, was originally named Weir Cook Municipal Airport because Mr. Cook was an ace in World War I. He had 7 victories, and unfortunately, he was killed flying a P-39 over New Caledonia in World War II. And this is a Warbird Heritage Foundation replica that in the next couple of weeks I'm going to be painting the Hat and the Ring insignia on. So I'm really excited about that. That'll be my first World War I piece, and it's not something you get to do every day, even doing the type of work that I do. So I'm really excited about that. And grateful to the Warbird Heritage Foundation for the opportunity. And that brings us to World War II. World War II, there were professional sign painters and artists. Everyone that you can think of was called to war. And a lot of these guys had that prior experience. And when they found themselves in their unit overseas, word got out that they could paint. And so their skills were often brought to bear designing and painting nose art on the planes. Conditions were pretty rough. They didn't have it easy like we do today in a nice warm hangar. Typically their conditions were either too hot or too cold. They had scrounge for paint, most often using house paint and thinning it with linseed oil or 100 octane aviation gas. And there wasn't always time to let the paint dry. Sometimes the planes would have to leave with the paint wet and come back and it'd be a mess. They'd have to clean it up and start over. And then sometimes, as it is in war, they might not come back at all. Most often it was not these guys' primary duty. They had their regular duties that they had to perform. And nose art was extracurricular, so they'd have to squeeze that in from time to time when they could. And the fees for painting nose art, it ranged from free to $50 to $75, or even just a case of beer or a bottle of whiskey. A lot of these guys, I think, saw it as a way to, boost morale and help their fellow men. And over the course of the conflict, they created really great artwork. We know the names of several of them, but the majority of them, we really don't know who they were. They've just kind of been lost to history, which is a shame. But some of these guys, probably all of them, really felt like it was just something to do to pass the time, and they were just doing their job. There were all kinds of topics for nose art. Comic books, movie characters, popular songs, sayings, dark humor, vulgar humor, patriotic themes, anti-Axis themes. But 55% of all nose art was pinup girls. And pinup girls were everywhere back then. Actresses, singers, entertainers, models, people like Rita Hayworth, Carol Landis, Dolores Moran, Ann Miller, and of course Betty Grable, the most famous of all. They appeared in calendars and playing cards, matchbooks, Esquire magazine, Laugh magazine, Yank magazine. There really was the heyday of the pinup at that time period. And this is a picture of J.W. Wilson painting Sleepy Time Gal, which we'll see later. And oftentimes they would draw out sketches and just to give an idea of what the crews wanted. Same thing that I do today. I draw out my sketches and present that to my clients and present a range of options, and they can tell me what they like or don't like, and go from there. These examples were done by Vernon Drake. Vernon Drake was a fine artist. He did several of the cartoons in the Army Air Force cadet books. He was a pilot in the CBI. He flew tankers in India over the hump. He also flew bombing missions into China. These are two of the surviving sketches compared with the finished artwork that he did. He did approximately 12 paintings, and his son, Larry Drake, recreated Wandering Wanda for the National Museum of World War II Aviation. And he became an architect after the war. And his son said that he always felt that being an architect kind of ruined his creativity because he got to be so creative during the war, painting the nose art and doing his own fine art, that he felt that architecture kind of stifled that. We're really lucky in that the Commemorative Air Force has this collection of nose art panels that were cut off from Walnut Ridge, as Keegan said. Minot Pratt, the general manager of the company scrapping them, had select ones cut off and set aside, with plans to build a fence out of them, which never happened, thankfully. And he donated them to the CAF in the 1960s. So you're seeing an original photo of mission completed and how it looks today. And it's really special to see these in person. If you've never seen them, I highly recommend taking a trip up to the EAA Museum at Oshkosh. It's really spectacular to see them in person and just imagine what they'll all look like in person. You know, we've spent decades and decades looking at these in black and white with the occasional color photo, but to stand there in person and see them in metal and paint is breathtaking. This is another one of Vernon Drake's pieces, Lassie, I'm Home, another survivor from Walnut Ridge. And you'll see this particular pinup girl pop up later. A lot of the pinup girls were repeated on different aircraft over and over as different people saw them and wanted them on their aircraft. So that's kind of a neat thing we're going to explore in a few minutes. So now we move on to the more famous ones. Everybody's probably familiar with the Enola Gay, dropped the first atomic bomb. It's interesting to know that Enola Gay was the first of the 509th aircraft to be painted, and it wasn't painted until we were actually loading Little Boy into the bomb bay. Paul Tibbets decided that he felt it would be nice if he named the plane after his mom, who supported his career in aviation against his father's wishes. So they sent someone to fetch Carl Allen. Carl was an artist who drew maps for the navigators to go on the bombing runs. And it was pretty simple. In fact, if you see his maps that he did, the lettering is very similar to what is on the Enola Gay. And of course, the Enola Gay is now at the National Air and Space Museum Annex at the Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia. I myself have not been to see it, but hopefully someday I can, because I imagine that's another awe-inspiring moment to be standing next to the Enola Gay. And the second silver plate aircraft, boxcar from the Nagasaki mission. Interesting to note that when that aircraft made the drop, it was not painted. There was no nose art. In fact, none of the 509th aircraft had nose art except for the Enola Gay. And those were all painted later. Porter Richardson did almost all of the 509th nose art. And if you look at them all together, You can really see his style. As you study nose art, and once you learn who the artists were, you can start to see their individual styles come through to the point to where you can almost recognize and say, I know who did that. And of course, Boxcar was stored in Arizona for a while and sent to the National Museum of the Air Force in 1961. And that I have seen when I was a kid. And it's pretty amazing to see something like that preserved. So I highly recommend a visit to the National Museum of the Air Force if you've never been. It's another amazing place, and one day is not enough. And that brings us to probably the most famous aircraft of all time, the Memphis Belle. I'm sure most of you are all familiar with the Memphis Belle and know that it was the star of the William Wyler documentary as being the first crew to achieve 25 combat missions. We know that it was named after Robert Morgan's sweetheart, Margaret Polk, of Memphis, Tennessee. And he originally intended to call the aircraft the Little One, which was his pet name for Polk. But after he and Jim Pernices saw the movie Lady for a Night, the leading character was named the Memphis Belle. So he proposed that name to the crew, and they voted on it, and they agreed. And the artist that painted it was, of course, Tony Starcer. He copied the pettigirl on both sides on the forward fuselage. And interesting to note that on the port side, it's blue, and on the red side, or starboard side, it's red. And the city of Memphis had the Memphis Belle until 2005, at which point it went to the National Museum of the Air Force, and they restored it, and it went on display for the first time after restoration in 2018. And there she is. She's beautiful. And there's the pinup that was used for the inspiration for that. George Petty work from 1941. Tony did a lot of nose art, which is probably why he's the most known. He was assigned to paint the tasks of painting official markings, squadron letters, and aircraft codes under the B-17s. As you can imagine, as soon as anybody figured out he was an artist, he was tapped to do nose art. And really some of the finest artwork to be seen in England for sure. Tony used mostly house paint. He drained off the surplus oil and added linseed oil to it to thin it to make it workable. You know, the weather was not always the greatest in England. Lots of cold weather working against him. Rain, of course. But it said that he could paint the nose art on the B-17 in a day or less, which is just incredible. And then he would do the jacket painting at night. And in all, it's estimated that he did 130 aircraft designs and unknown amount of jackets. Shoo Shoo Baby, this is a picture of it during the war. And then the restored version in the Air Force Museum. And as you can see, it's painted OD now. That was because the aluminum was deemed not good enough to be in natural metal finish at the time. Of course, today, you know, people take airplanes from literally scraps and rebuild them. And so I bet if it was redone again today, they could probably handle doing that in the natural metal finish. And this brings us to Don Allen. Don Allen was in the 4th Fighter Group. Let's see. He did approximately 39 nose art designs on P-47s and P-51s. Now, he's another one that had a really unique style, and as you study him and learn which pieces that he did, you start to see that style emerge. You know, if you look here at these two women, you can definitely see that they were done by the same artist. They have the same general proportions and the same shapes, the same face. You know, it's really great work. Shangri-La, of course, is very famous. Don Gentile's aircraft. And here's a picture of Dick Mansfield painting kill markings in some promotional photos. And of course, Shangri-La went in after Don was buzzing the field, and the propeller touched the ground and had a hard landing, broke the aircraft. But when he went back to the States to do a promotional tour, they painted up a new P-51D for him. And he toured that around for US war bond drives. And this one, Yippee Joe, that's just a really awesome caricature of a P-51 as a bucking Bronco. This guy riding it. And it's one of my favorites. That's just a great drawing, painting. And here he is with Blondie. And you start to see his lettering. He developed a unique lettering style, and that lettering carried on to several different aircraft, like Meg and Iron Ass, Red Dog, Sweet Arlene, Little Aggie, Screwball, Mike and Back. And I don't think this was a lettering font. We call them fonts now, but a letter set. I think this was one that he just invented on his own, and it's a really interesting letter form. Got the thicks and thins and the swirlies, and it's really instantly recognizable with the work of Don Allen. And next is Al Merkling. Al became an illustrator before the war, and he got a job at a toy company designing toys. When he went into the Army Air Force, he was a photo lab technician, but he hated working in the darkroom. But he kept sketching and drawing, as artists tend to do, and that got someone's attention. And eventually he was asked to put nose art on a plane. They flew B-24s or F-7s, which is the camera version, for the photo mapping work. And this is patched up piece we can see there. He used whatever he could find for paint. Paint was pretty hard to come by in the South Pacific, as you can imagine, and it was really hot. The paint would just bake as soon as it was put on the plane. Sometimes the liquid will sizzle out of it as soon as you touch the surface. A lot of the artists that we'll see used reference material from Esquire or the calendars and whatnot, but Al did his own artwork. He drew them all up from his own imagination. And he had a really creative eye for typography too. If you see the lettering and patched up piece, it's all made up of quilted patchwork. And if you note in these pictures, the aircraft is painted. But as the war went on, they stripped the paint off. Rather than trying to strip around the lettering, he just redid it, which is pretty cool that they were able to save it. Of course, they were able to save the girl and just added the circle, and it's probably the original paint, the blue paint, I guess. Well, it looks blue in the photo. And we didn't just do girls. This is the Bourbon boxcar, which is a pretty fun caricature of a boxcar. B-24s were thought of as boxcars because they were so big and square. And here he's painting the rip snorter, and there you can see it in color. It's always exciting to see the color photos. Here's Hangover Haven, before and after. And it's certainly sad to see them all there, just scrapped and not saved. But unfortunately, we couldn't save all of them. There's a lot of raw materials that needed to go back to the industries, so that's what happened. This is one of the C-47 hot pants. Cherokee strip and Queen May. Queen May is a really stunning example. Here's the Photo Queen. I mentioned the lettering. Well, here's the lettering in Photo Queen, and if you look close, each letter is made up of abstract photographs. I can't imagine how long it took to paint those, but that is just an outstanding example of typography becoming artwork itself. And that brings us to Sarkis Bergen. He was really considered the Michelangelo of World War II aviation art because his canvases were big. He really took advantage of the B-24 as a giant canvas and used that to full advantage. And here's Last Horizon with a scene of the Golden Gate Bridge, rum and coke. Cocktail hour, after hours. And really, after hours is very minimalist compared to some of his later works. Here's Mabel's label. That was a portraiture of his wife, Mabel. And there it is at the scrapyard before it was scrapped down. I'm not sure if this is Walnut Ridge or Kingman. I would assume it's Kingman. And the Dragon in Its Tail, his masterpiece. I think everybody's probably familiar with this one. Collins Foundation flew their B-24 as Dragon in Its Tail about 20 years ago. And it's really a spectacular piece of artwork. And it goes from literally the nose of the plane all the way to the tail. And said that the Dragon in Its Tail was the last plane to be scrapped at Kingman because the crews were hoping someone would come along and save it, which of course they didn't. Can you imagine if they had, seeing that today? And that brings us to Hal Olsen. Hal Olsen was a U.S. Navy autopilot specialist on Tinian. He was a painter before the war. Before he was sent out to the Pacific, he stocked up on oil paint and brushes. He was hoping to paint the landscapes of the Pacific Islands, but the war-torn island landscape differed from his expectations. Shortly after he got to Tinian, the Japanese attack destroyed the Navy's paint store, and all of the paint used by the resident nose art painter. And at this point, Hal took that opportunity to take over, since he did have paint, and really embarked on creating a great body of work. And he would draw a grid onto the side of the plane using a pinup calendar for reference. And we have to do it in his off hours. He didn't have time to do it during the day. But he got so busy that he would have flesh tones mixed by the gallon, which is pretty crazy to think about. A lot of the works were nudes. In fact, I was hard pressed to find photographs of his work for this presentation that weren't nude. But these two are some of my favorites, The Tourist and Wild Cherry. Both of them are based on Varga illustrations. Another Varga, Touche, Super Chief. And he was featured in the first ever color issue of National Geographic in 1948. And I was fortunate to get to talk to Hal Olsen, courtesy of Will Tate, the author of Paint Locker Magic. One day we were having a conversation on Wix, I believe it was, the World Information Exchange, and we were messaging back and forth. And Will said he knew Hal, and I said, "Wow, I'd really like to talk to him." So he said, "I can make that happen." So he got me Hal's phone number after clearing it with him, and I called him up and asked him lots of questions. Asked him, how he went about the process, how he did everything. Of course, he used the grid, and draw the grid on the airplane and grid them out. That's, if you don't know what that is, you take, say you have your artwork on a letter-sized piece of paper, or from the calendar or whatever, you start drawing 1-inch squares into a grid, and then you draw that same grid on the side of the plane at a bigger scale, perhaps 6 inches instead of 1 inch. And then that gives you a way to draw each section out, and it's not quite as overwhelming as it is sometimes on a large surface trying to do the whole thing at once. It's a really effective technique. And he also told me about thinning the paint with aviation fuel, and how hot it was, all the work that he got to do. How he came back and was an artist after the war. It was a really interesting conversation, and I'm so thankful to Will for making that happen. I never would have imagined that I could talk to someone who actually painted these aircraft that I've been reading about my whole life. And it was really something I'll never forget. Of course, this is Easy Made, part of the Commemorative Air Force collection. So we do have a surviving piece of Hal Olsen's art, which is amazing. I tried to get the Pensacola Museum, the Navy Museum, to take their PB4Y and put some Hal Olsen art on there, but we weren't really successful in that. And they've got bigger issues anyway right now. But that would be really amazing. At the time, I wanted them to fly Hal out there so he could supervise, and I would work painting the nose art onto the plane. I think that would have been a really good opportunity for them as a museum, but it wasn't in the cards, and sadly he passed away, and that opportunity vanished. But that brings us to George Petty. You see another one of Hal Olsen's works. George Petty worked as an artist in Chicago, painting calendar girls and magazine covers for Household magazine, and opened his own studio in 1926. He did the Chicago World's Fair poster, and is really known for the Petty Girl. But he didn't just do the pinup art. He did lots of ads too. He did ads for Janssen swimsuits, Best Form women's undergarments, the Ice Capades, Gruen watches, Capper and Capper pajamas. He did recruitment posters for the Navy, and he did an illustration of Rita Hayworth for a cover of Time magazine in 1941. So here's one of his gatefolds from Esquire magazine. And as you can see, we've got two different planes here with the same artwork. A lot of the guys would see this artwork, and of course more than one would want that artwork on their plane in all theaters of the war, from England to the Mediterranean to the South Pacific. Everybody would see these same pieces of art and want it for their plane. So this is to illustrate different artists' interpretations of George Petty's work. So we've got a P-38 Spitfire. It was used at Dayton for testing. A B-24 and a B-25. And this is just a fraction of them. I had a lot more that I could have shared, but didn't want to go too long. And here's another example, the Salem Witch from another one of his pieces on a B-29. And the Lady in the Swing also appeared several times here on Heavenly Body and Shoot the Works. And another one for our private stock. Sometimes the artists, if they were sign painters or illustrators before the war and they were really skilled, they would stay pretty true to the inspiration piece and would turn out looking really close to that piece. Here's Angel of the Skies again. Here's another witch, which brings us to Gil Elvgren. Also Chicago. I probably didn't say earlier, but I'm in Chicago, so these two artists have a personal connection for me. Gil went to the the American Academy of Art in Chicago, and he graduated during the Depression, and he joined the ad agency Stevens and Gross and worked there before the war. And I began painting pinups for Louis Dow, one of the leading publishing companies, in 1937, and did about 60 works for them on 28 by 22 canvases. And lots of those calendars went out, and lots of his work appeared on nose art in World War II. And here we have Puddle Jumper and Bird's Eye View, two B-24s. You see Bird's Eye View even gets a cameo there by presumably Donald Duck. Sleepy Time Gal. This one also appeared on quite a bit of aircraft. And the Blonde in the Towel. This one also appeared on a lot of aircraft. Here we see it on California Cutie, P-38, Innocents Abroad, B-24, and of course, Surprise Attack. This is also one of the Commemorative Air Force collection pieces. And it's really impressive to stand in those panels and just stare up at them. And just when I go, I study every brushstroke and just imagine, these guys painting that. As an artist, it's really special to see them. And here's another one, the Knockout, here on P-47 for Rough and Ready, and a jacket on Belle of the Brawl. I believe Belle of the Brawl was a B-17 that did not have a pinup on it. It only had lettering, at least in the research that I've done. So if anybody knows or has a picture, if that did have this girl on the back, I'd love to see it. Or if this was just a case of wanting a pinup on the jacket, I'd like you to have this photo for sure. And this brings us into Alberto Vargas. This is another one of his often copied girls from a gatefold of Esquire. And it's pretty cool on this one to see the bombing missions denoted by boots. That's a pretty rare and interesting thing. Pretty cool. So Alberto Vargas did work as an illustrator for Ziegfeld Follies and many Hollywood studios. And he worked, of course, for Esquire magazine. Esquire was wanting to replace George Petty, and when they found Vargas, they hired him, and he really ended up to be the perfect replacement for Petty. He signed his art as Varga. He dropped the S, presumably to have his name sound less ethnic for whatever reason. It's kind of silly, but here's some of his examples. The redhead, that one too appears on a lot of them, and you'll see a Piece of Mind that uses that particular pinup as well coming up. This one was used on a ton of aircraft. We've got a B-25 and a B-29. B-26, more B-24s, B-29, another B-26. So here you can see how the different artists have reinterpreted this particular pose. Of course, we can't tell in black and white, but presumably these were blondes, but Shady Lady, this guy made her have black hair. And since her hair ribbon there is black too, and you really can't see any kind of definition, you don't know if he just didn't have time to mix up any yellow paint or if that was a conscious decision to keep it dark. We'll never know, but it's certainly interesting. Here's some more on a C-47, P-47, an F-5, which is the reconnaissance version of the P-38. A really stunning color photo of Ginger Snap. And again, Ginger Snap has black hair as well. And she didn't get the same outfit, she got a red outfit. So it really was up to each artist's interpretation to make it their own piece. Excuse me, which is something that all artists do. I do it, and everyone does that. We have Lady in the Dark. This pose is on Mishap B-25 now. It was on the Mishap B-29. It was a model that I built in college or high school for the state fair. Here we see some more versions. Interesting that the B-25 version, she has curly hair, not the straight hair. So that's another variation. And the Patriotic Gal, or Sleepy Time Gal, this one also was on a lot of different versions. Well, here we see it on a B-24, PB-4Y. And that's the one that J.T. Wilson was painting earlier that I mentioned. Here it is finished. B-24, P-50, well, not the P-51, but here you can see nose art ended up on absolutely everything. It wasn't limited to bombers and fighters. The liaison planes got it, the C-47s got it, the C-45s, the Jeeps, sometimes doors of tents, the walls of the squadron room, the bars in the officers club, anything that everything that could get a pinup on it usually did. Here's a P-47 over here, P-17 for Sleepy Time Gal. Night mission. Now this artist chose to drop off the outfit and just put her in a bra. A little bit racy. But by the time period, still demure, because most of the nose art, they were nude. And oftentimes they'd have to be painted over for their trips back to the States, as it happened with one of Hal Olsen's pieces on the B-29 up in Atom. And of course, Sack Time, another part of the Commemorative Air Force collection.
Chad, I've got something to interject here real quick. Patriotic
Sure.
Gal is kind of an interesting example of a pinup girl because um, the poem that accompanies the art is actually about how the patriotic gal is a real peach of a pal because she's cut what is, you know, the ankle length nightgown down to use the excess fabric for bandages. So even the pinup girls themselves are kind of a product of the time. So the act of painting them onto the airplanes is kind of almost a logical extension of these women portrayed in these kind of alluring poses, but also said to be giving their best to the war effort.
No, that's a great point, Keegan. Everybody was doing their part for the war effort. I think Rita Hayworth even took off the bumpers of her car for the scrap drive. And so that brings us to Owen Hughes. Owen is, as you can see, turned 101 on March 31st recently. And Owen went viral, trying to get 101,000 likes for his birthday. And he went well over that for sure. Not much is really known about Owen. There's almost no photos that exist of his artwork that are known, at least, with the exception of Virgin on the Verge. He didn't really take pictures of his work. He was stationed at the 10th Air Depot, and he did over 100 aircraft, but he didn't really keep track of them, or we don't know what that list was and what it entailed. So that's a bit disappointing for us artist historians, but we're really fortunate that he's still with us and 101 years old, if you can imagine that. Before the war, he designed, painted, built, and installed billboards for an outdoor advertising company. And during the war, he painted signs for the 10th Depot. And when he was done doing that, he would start painting the nose art. Since he had to do it after hours, he usually painted from 6 until sunset. Sometimes you have to use a flashlight to finish his job. Generally, though, Owen says he didn't charge anything for his artwork. He was just happy to do it and help out. And he bartered for the artwork, and he loved to fly, he liked to go up in the planes. So he traded a lot of his nose art for airplane rides. As you can see, if you're familiar with Doc, B-29, he painted the nose art on that. So anybody out there knows Owen, I would certainly like to wish him well and a happy belated birthday. And now we get into the jackets. So if you had a plane painted with a name and nose art, you had your A2, well, of course you wanted your jacket to be painted to match. Sometimes they matched, sometimes they didn't. So here's some examples. Rosie's sweatbox with the tail, that's pretty cool. the B-29 pistol packing mama. You can see at first glance, these all three look the same, but if you start to look closer, they're all very different. The lettering is pretty similar, but the B-17 on the first two is a different size, and on the third one, it's going the opposite direction. And you notice each of the three jackets has a different style and placement of the swastikas. First one, they're square and stacked. The second one, they're at an angle and in a row. And the third one, it's a lot bigger and has a drop shadow. So that's pretty interesting. And of course, these jackets were prized by their owners, rightfully so. And oftentimes they would hold on to them for decades, just hanging in a closet until they would give them to family members or they would be sold off in estate sales, at which point collectors would buy them. And there's tons of them surviving today. Some of them are a little bit crude. Some of them are just gorgeous, like this P-38 version, which you can see the owner wearing it on his bicycle. Let's look at those bombing missions. This gentleman was stationed in Italy, of course. And he really wanted to know, wanted everyone to know what he'd been through with all those bombing missions. That's really great. But as you can see on the back, you know, this paint doesn't survive. It wasn't meant to survive for decades and decades. So they start to flake off, and really becomes a piece for conservation. You have to take special care to prevent any more flakes coming off and losing more of the artwork. And that brings me into some of my own artwork. I was asked by the Commemorative Air Force in 2007 to do the artwork for 927. So these are some of the sketches that I submitted. I was on the Wix board that I mentioned earlier, and Gary had a thread going on there that chronicled the evolution of his conversion of the B-24 into a B-24A. And he would post pictures up every day or every other day, and really got the enthusiast community involved in what he was doing to the aircraft. So we emailed and messaged back and forth quite a bit. And one day he asked me to submit some sketches, which made me very happy, so I did. So these are some of the sketches. I really like the idea of the train, you know, the locomotive. B-24 is really big and powerful, like a locomotive, so I thought that would be a fun caricature. And they didn't want a pinup girl on it when they redid it. Gary said that the staff felt that, you know, they'd had the girl, they wanted something different. So this is the direction that I was asked to go in. So I did some different character studies of B-24, trying to cartoon it, giving it a personality, making it a character, kind of like the old cartoons in the 30s and 40s, in different lettering styles. And from there, once we picked a direction, I drew it up on the computer, and this is what the final art looked like. And I do this with all of my clients. It's a real advantage to how I work for my clients. Once I get the artwork drawn on the computer, I do that to quickly change colors and try different things, try different placements. It's a very organic process once I get, you know, the sketch going, and I know I've got my roadmap to get there, but you know, I may change a few things here and there as I see fit as I'm going. And as a result, when this is done on the computer, I share these files with my clients so that they can go on to use them for t-shirts or patches or marketing materials, signage, whatever. And then I've mocked up this version of what it would look like on the plane for them. And it got approved, and we were off to the races. So I went to Midland and got to meet Gary in person for the first time. And Gary was really an outstanding individual. He welcomed us, was very helpful, wanted us to have everything we needed to get the job done, showed us around, took us to his house, gave us a tour of his collection. Just a great guy. And he really made this project special for us, for sure. And I miss him. So we got started. I project the artwork onto the planes. You can see the tarps up. There was an event going on for a couple of days at the hangar, and Gary didn't want anything getting out, so we put up those to hide it. So it was pretty dark in there. So we got it drawn onto the plane. Brought down my friends Mike Eady and Sean Calger, and also my dad. I'd never done painting on a plane. I'd painted things before, but nothing at that scale, not in that compressed of a time frame. So I knew I needed help. So I asked these guys if they would come help me, and they jumped at the chance, as did I. And we knocked it out in 4 days. So that's the first application of color. There's Sean putting on the blue. There's our table for our paint where we mixed everything up. We did use aviation fuel. Gary brought it over to us, said, here you go. That's what they used then. You can use it now, which was fun. There's more painting. We started out with washes just to get some color down and block it all out. And that was my first time at Midland. So we did take a break and went into the museum to see the nose art panels. That was my first time seeing them, and it was a special experience for sure. And like I said, I had the program from '77 from the air show. I had pictures of this stuff in it, and to be standing in front of it was really amazing. Especially Flaming Maybe. That's one of my favorites, and probably the closest of all of them in the collection to what my style has evolved into. So I really have a special place in my heart for that one. It said no photos in the museum, but I couldn't help myself. And Gary didn't mind. Here's my dad painting with us. And Gary inspecting. We take breaks periodically, stretch out, walk around. Here's the P-82, which I had never seen one in person before other than the Air Force Museum. I won't be able to touch it, so that was pretty cool to see. And on another break, Gary took us out to the back lot at CAF, which was really cool to see all this old stuff, the Mauler and the B-23. The two Maulers, he had two of them. Mikey with the B-24 cowling. His grandfather was shot down in a B-24 in a prison camp in Yugoslavia, so he got a real thrill out of taking that picture. And Sean and I, and, detail of painting the engine. My dad painting again. You know, this trip surprised me because I'd never seen my dad do too much artistic work. My mom was more the artist over my dad, but he did do some drafting when he was younger, and he's got a real good eye for detail. So it's pretty awesome to be able to share that experience with him. And we had fun. It was a lot of work, but it was fun. At one point, they were still working on the plane. He'd be drawing a line, pulling a line on the plane, and start to bounce up and down. I'm like, oh no. So we joked, you know, now we know what it was like for the guys doing it during the war. You know, people working on the planes and the planes bouncing around and moving. And we got a chuckle out of that. This is Sean's Bob Ross Happy Cloud. He wanted to put in a happy cloud. We're getting close to the end here. This side of the plane was pretty dark in that hangar, so we had to use the projector as a light to help see what we were doing. And almost to the end, Mikey and my dad. And there it is. 4 days of hard work and fun, and great times. Lots of good memories there. And then, of course, in Indianapolis, we got to go up in it and fly, take a ride, which is really cool. It was my first Warbird ride. I'd been in a DC-3 before, but I'd never been in a real Warbird, so that was a real thrill. And there she is flying. And I made the cover of Warbird Digest and Air Classics, which is pretty cool. I loved Warbird Digest, and I've been reading Air Classics since I was a kid. So to be involved in that and have my artwork on there and be interviewed inside was really pretty awesome. So special thanks to Gary for making that happen and for giving me my start in painting this nose art. And the next one was the C-47 Do It, First Air Commandos. So Chris Henry got in touch with me. He was working with the Grissom Air Museum, and they wanted to repaint their C-47 as Do It to honor Jim Haas, who was a surviving veteran. And they had met him. He was from the Pittsburgh area, I believe, which is where Chris was from. And they thought it would be really great to honor him. And so Chris asked me to become involved, and I jumped at the chance again. And so here you see some original photos of the aircraft. And it's not the best example of painting. This artist had some skills, but not super high quality like some of the works that we've seen from Hal Olsen and Tony Starcer. But there it is. So I wasn't sure how I wanted to approach this. If I should replicate it exactly as it was, or if I should improve upon it and make it a little bit different and make it my own. So I messaged Gary Velasco to get his opinion. I had his book, Fighting Colors, which is an excellent book. Goes over a lot of the history of nose art, and I really valued his opinion. So he said, just go for it and, do the best that you can do and make it your own. So I kind of took that advice and ran with it and did my own thing. I didn't try to copy exactly the Varga pinup girl. I tried to stay closer to what was actually on the plane, but with a few more touches, a few more embellishments, and everybody was really happy with it. So we made plans to go out there to the museum and start painting. This was in April of 2011. So it was a nice, beautiful spring day when I got there. I had to go find some scaffolding and drag it over there. And as you can see, it's a little bit precarious. It looks precarious, and it definitely was. I had to be careful. Probably not unlike the guys back in the day, which is what I told myself as I was hanging off of it. But I printed out my artwork and tiled it together to make a template so I could rub it and then transfer the drawing to the aircraft. But somewhere along the line, my dimensions were not right, and it came out too big. When I got it taped on the plane, I could see right away it was just going to be way too big and out of scale. So I had to scrap that idea. Here you can see my boards and ladders on the scaffolding. So that was just as fun as it looks. So plan B, I had to draw it on the plane, which was a little nerve-wracking, but I took a deep breath and went to town and took my time, and it turned out pretty good. I was really happy with it.
Chad, quick question for you. What did you use to draw it on there?
It's a water-soluble pencil, so it washes off with water. Kind of like a grease pencil, but it's more water-soluble. So I didn't waste any time. I got out my paint and started blocking out the flesh tones. And you can see the lettering for Do It. When I first sketched it out, as I got back down on the ground and looked at it, I could see that it was way too big. That wasn't going to work. So then I started on the hair. As you go, I black out each color individually, start building it up as layers. So as we go through these, she'll look kind of funny without the black outline to tie it all together. Unlike an illustrator or like a kind of comic book or any other kind of illustrator where you're drawing everything out first and then adding color, when you're painting, after you've got your sketch on, you start blocking in the color. You don't want to do the final black outline until the very end so that it ties everything together. So by the end of the day, I had the first flesh tone done, first hair down, and the pink for her skirt down. So you can see the P-25 sitting beside it, which was a Catch-22 movie veteran, which is pretty cool. Chris took this picture of me up there that night. So the next day, My dad and my Uncle Bob came to visit, see what was going on. It's my Uncle Bob to the left. He was a crew chief on C-47s during the Korean War, and went down in one, belly landed. He was with the Kyushu Gypsies, and so it was really cool to have him there, tell me all the stories of C-47s and his time with them. And my dad, I mentioned it before, but my dad was in the Air Force, Vietnam at Da Nang, with the 366th gunfighters at Da Nang. I worked in the motor pool. So these two guys are responsible for my love of airplanes. Unlike the first day, which was really nice and warm, the second day was cold. It was about 42 degrees and misty when I got to the museum that day, and it was windy. Every time I'd even get close to the fuselage, the wind would blow the paint right off the brush and onto the plane. It was nuts. So Dad had that blanket in his car. I had the Mexican blanket in mine. So we rigged up with the ladder some kind of windbreak. And he stood there and watched and held it all together for a couple hours while I painted, which was immensely helpful because that wind was cold too. So there I'm working on details of the hair. I mixed up a darker shade. Usually try to do 3 colors in my hair just to give it a stylized look and give it some direction and flow and curls. So there in the second picture, you can see that the hair is all done, blocked in. I've got the shadows in on the skirt. I'm working on the face details and the shadows. And Dad told me to take a break. So he started doing some black outlining for me. And there it is, just about done. You can see the do-it lettering. And before I had it, between 2 rows of rivets there with the 3rd row in the middle, which was way too big. So after I looked at the photo, I scaled it back down. There's a photo of my paint box. It's a World War II mechanics toolbox. I keep all my paint in. I use one-shot paint. So there it is, finished with my dad and my Uncle Bob, my dad Gary. Me with Chris Henry. The Haas family got to come to the dedication and see it and take place in that event, and they were just tickled pink about it. They were really happy to have, their dad honored, grandfather honored, and unfortunately, he passed away about 2 weeks after the dedication, so we got it in just in the nick of time. And that leads us to That's All Brother. So you guys, I'm sure all know the history on That's All Brother, one of the lead aircraft in the D-Day invasion. So the lettering appears on both sides of the nose. And everybody, I'm sure, saw that in pictures in Oshkosh when it was all modeled together. So my challenge was to draw it out correctly as it was in the photo. When whoever it was drew that out first time, they did a really good job of trying to match the lettering. But I'm really particular about lettering design because I'm a graphic designer and that's what I do all day, every day. So I went back in and started from scratch and studied the photos and drew it all up letter by letter to match it as best as I could. And so you see in the middle, there's a line there. That's the line of rivets that's intersecting the B, which you'll see why I did that later. You know, we were lucky that there were photos at all, but we were not so lucky in that the right side photo is not very good. But in studying it, I could see that it was not exactly the same. A lot of model builders have built it as the same on both sides, and the CAF originally had it the same on both sides, but that wasn't historically accurate. So using this photo and the other side as a basis, I tried to draw that up as best as I could using different reference points on the plane to get the angle and figure out where it was in the process so that I could match it and we could end up with artwork that was as close to the photo as possible. Now, it's probably not exact because every artist does things different from side to side, which is a clear case in this instance, but we want to do the best job that we could. So I got my computer and my projector, went down to San Marcos and projected the art onto the aircraft. So here you can see where that line comes into play. That gave me a reference point to line up the artwork and put it where we needed it to be based on the photos. So Andy Mag from the CAF stood on the ground with the photo with the same orientation and position as the photographer. So we could try and match that up as best as we could. So we made some adjustments here and there. I had to change a few things on the fly on the computer till we got it exactly right. But we got it. So here is getting the artwork all drawn out there. Here's a detail. If you look to the left, you'll notice that there's no opening quote on the name. And in studying the photos, that was left off. It never had opening quotes on the real plane. So I didn't put them on this one, or this version of the nose art. So I'm starting to lay out the colors. And yellow is a real hard color to put down. It doesn't cover very well. If you've ever painted anything yellow, you found that out pretty quick. So a trick is to take a little bit of white paint and mix it in with the yellow. And to the naked eye, it's not really any difference at all, but it adds just enough pigment in there that it helps the coverage and you're able to go a lot faster. I did That's All Brother in 2 passes of the yellow, where on 0927, where we didn't mix white in, it took 4 passes, which was stressful for sure, because we didn't have time to have to do 4 passes. More details of the lettering. Here's a photo of me painting. That's my, I usually dress up in somewhat period looking clothes. I like to have swing music playing just to get me into the mindset of the era. I love that music. I'm a swing dancer, and that's how I met my wife. So creating that ambiance is all part of the fun for me. And there you can see the first coat. And there you can really notice the only one quote on there. So then we moved over to the other side. Started marking that out, started painting. So the paint. See, we're getting short on time. I'll start going a little faster, Keegan.
Not a problem. I think everyone's really enjoying getting the opportunity to kind of look behind the scenes at the process. Chad, can you talk a little bit about what's needed in terms of surface prep to begin the painting process?
Most of the planes that I've done have been fresh paint, so I haven't really had to do a whole lot. Sometimes you can scuff it up with a Scotch-Brite pad to help the paint adhesion, but the one-shot sticks pretty well, so I don't really do a whole lot other than degreasing it. And here we are adding the black drop shadow. And there's that side's done.
Chad, you mentioned you're going to be painting a fabric-covered airplane shortly. Is there a big difference in the paint application to a fabric-covered airplane versus an aluminum one, in your experience?
No, I don't think there is. I asked a similar question to the guys about that with the aircraft, and they thought by using the enamels that I use, it really shouldn't be a problem. I've had in the past, if I'm working with a lacquer-based paint, it tends to reactivate the paint underneath. So if you don't get the breaststroke pulled just right the first time and you go back and do it a second time, it'll start to mix with the underlying color, which is kind of a bad deal. And if you're mixing with lacquer thinner, that has a different drying time than enamel thinners do, the turpentine mineral spirits. So you've got to be real careful you don't get it too wet and get runs, because that'll eat the paint off too. On this slide, this is the can of paint that I mixed up in case they needed it. I didn't sign this on the aircraft because it's so historical and has such a special place in history. I didn't want to sign it, so I signed the can.
On the subject of its historical significance, Chad, do you ever kind of find yourself reflecting on that while you're actually doing the painting?
Oh, all the time. It's as a student and historian of that time period, from the art and the music to the war. Well, I'll back up. It's just all, I just love all of that stuff. And, sometimes you have to pinch yourself and say, wow, am I really doing this? So after I finished the nose art, I got to go up in the first public ride flight, and that's all brother, which is pretty awesome. So we flew over San Marcos, which is really beautiful. I had no idea. And of course, I got to meet Dick Cole, famous, of course, for the Doolittle raid, but also first air commando pilot. Did a lot in C-47s and flew the hump, and it was really special to meet him. And that hat that I was wearing, he actually signed it, so I retired that hat, and it's in my display case now. And here's That's All Brother flying over Normandy. I know it was really special for everybody who got to partake in that. I got to go to England this past fall and go to Duxford. And one of my clients, Aerocraft Panels, asked me to come over and paint nose art on site, so I did. So I painted this up, and it was real popular. And it was really special to be at Duxford too, let me tell you. The EAA Berlin Express, I did not paint this one, but in the restoration process, I was asked to help out designing the artwork that it wore in the movie by Chris Henry. So I did. I found old pictures from the movie and drew up the artwork. And that summer it was at Oshkosh, and they put a sticker on the side of the plane. So that's pretty cool to see. And now, of course, it's all totally restored, and it's vinyl on the plane. But it looks great. It's cool that this one's flying again.
Chad, with the aircraft paint being kind of specifically designed as a coating to exist out in the elements, do you have to seal over top of your artwork to kind of maintain that consistent finish with the rest of the airplane?
I always tell clients that they can if they want to, but they don't have to. The paint that I use, One Shot, it's made for sign painting, so it's got a pretty good shelf life out in the elements. That's what it's made to do. And the majority of the aircraft now are kept inside anyway, so the artwork could last years and not have to be touched up. Vinyl has a much shorter shelf life. It starts to crack and peel in the sun. Anything that's in vinyl eventually will have to be redone for sure. And paint's always better. They used paint during the war, so in a historically accurate restoration, you want to use paint. So a project I've been working on for the past year is Beach City Baby. Jason's going to kill me because I put C-47. It's actually a C-53. I had served in Operation Torch, and he found it in Ohio and worked with his crew of volunteers to get it flying and flew it back to their home base and are continuing to work on it to get it airworthy and completely restored as a museum. So Jason, I got in touch with Jason through my friend Mo, and in talking to Jason, he wanted a pinup girl. He'd been using a pinup girl kind of from the internet, and in talking to him, I told him we needed to have something more unique and ownable by him. So we started looking at different C-47 photos from the area as a reference, just to kind of see the style and see what was done. And of course, Beachcomber was most in line of what we wanted to do and where we wanted to take it. So when I work on a project, I'll study the pinup girls from the era. So in Jason's case, his aircraft was the service. It was in 1943 was the time that he wanted it to represent. So that's the time that I looked for reference material. I don't look at anything from 44 or 45 because in his case, it wouldn't have existed yet. So it just wouldn't be a period of correct detail. So that's something that I'm very particular about. If I'm going to use a specific girl as an inspiration, as was done, then it has to be from the right time period. And I also have a collection of pre-war lettering and sign books, so I can study the typefaces and see what they used. Because I'm a graphic designer, I also study the graphic design of that time period, just so that I can become fully immersed in the lettering and what they would have done and what they wouldn't have done. And it's just something that I really geek out about and am passionate about. So these were the 4 of the 5 girls that I presented to Jason. And this was the one he chose. I also presented several different lettering styles. There's some of the work from 1942 book. And then I put them onto a C-53 to kind of mock that up to give him an idea of what it would look like. And this is where we ended up. Now this lettering is not based on anything other than just my own hand and my experience with the time period. I really try to stay away from any computerized fonts because most of the fonts, unless you know the history, they weren't even invented yet during the war. There are some that, of course, were in use during the war, and I have the books to back that up. But that aspect of the typography is really important to me.
Chad, how long did it take you to assemble your collection of vintage typography collections and advertising materials that you use to reference in designing these pieces?
It's just been over years. eBay is a big help. Sometimes you find them at estate sales. You know, the magazines aren't as hard to find, but the lettering books are really hard to find. The design annuals are really hard to find and expensive when you do find them. So it's an investment, but I feel it's important. It's just another way as a working graphic designer professionally to take me even further into that time period because I love it so much.
I assume that the materials aren't being listed for sale with the expectation that they would end up in the collection of someone who is working on aircraft nose art. Is there another part of the industry that tends to utilize those materials?
Yeah, you know, before computers, you know, everything was done by hand. So you would have to look at a type book and it would list out the whole alphabet. And so you would start tracing letters on a light table and trace the letters into words and then trace words into headlines. And then once that was done, you'd have to ink it all by hand. So it was a much different process than what people are used to today, where it's, you know, 100 times easier on a computer. Which is why I felt it was important on this lettering to do it by hand. I have a digitized tablet and a pen that I can draw the brushstrokes by hand. So even though it's digital, I'm still doing it by hand. And this is a t-shirt design that I did for them and some model aircraft decals for the 1/48 and 1/72 scale. And I redrew that patch for vintage wings as well. And I'm also working with the guys in England with the night fight restoration. This plane was also a D-Day veteran. It served out the course of the war. It was in all the major campaigns. And you can see in this photo, that's the 1944 version that it wore on D-Day, which is just one color. And the version on the right, over time, you can see they embellished it. It's got a different color inside the tow cable. They painted the plane probably black, I would guess, and the glider black as well, and added some flak. Because on this aircraft's, I think it was the second mission for D-Day, it towed gliders and got shot up pretty bad. It took them 4 days to fix it. So you can see that they've incorporated the flak into the nose art design. So here's Charlie and Neil of the night fright restoration. So when I was in England, I got to drive up to Coventry to see those guys and meet them and look at the plane, see what a great job they're doing with that. So here you can see my artwork where I drew up the art to be as close as possible to the original photographs. And while I was at Duxford, Charlie sent me a text. He's like, hey, what if you painted Night Fright on a panel while you're there at Duxford? I said, okay, sure. I don't have a panel. So they couriered this panel, which is an actual skin off of Knife Right, up to the air show, and I painted it on Sunday. So that was pretty cool. This is a T-33 project that I did for the Warbird Heritage Foundation. They were doing their T-33 in the 16th Fighter Squadron markings, and the tail insignia was a duck. And there's really no good photographs. You can see in both of these photos, you can't really see anything. The only reference material that we had was a patch, and the patch is pretty crude. It was a duck. Most we assumed to be Donald Duck, but it was crude. So we all decided that we would make it look more like Donald Duck. And these are the finished pieces from the computer. And so I presented these to them. And it wasn't a case of just flipping the image over to the other side. I had to take and switch hands. So it's a different piece of art on the other side, because you would have the control stick in your right hand, which wouldn't make sense if it was just flipped. So I got my measurements out and drew it onto the tail and started blocking it in. And there's the finished piece. Again, you can see just how much difference the black makes versus just the color being blocked in. You know, it really finishes the piece up. And here it is in their hangar, all ready to go and installed back on the aircraft. Hopefully soon we'll be able to see that one flying again. It's getting close, I hear.
Chad, you mentioned earlier that there's a kind of mixture of art on these airplanes. Some is pinup girls, some is cartoon characters. We've had a question asked about Disney and their involvement with the creation of nose art or squadron insignia. In your research, have you kind of learned anything about Disney's official involvement, or just how frequently their characters were knocked off by air crews?
Oh yeah, for sure. I had a whole section on Disney for this presentation, but it got to be too long, so we'll have to do it again sometime. But Disney characters were definitely used on aircraft in the war, not only by artists in the various theaters of operations, but by actual Disney artists at the Lockheed plant. They sent guys over to the Lockheed plant and would paint different artwork on the Venturas as they were coming off the assembly line, which is pretty cool. I don't have any photos for this time, but maybe next time.
Well, I think Disney probably could be its whole own presentation about how they interacted with the war and the production of training materials. And Walt Disney himself kind of had held a fond view of American servicemen, and it wasn't uncommon that if they wrote with a request that his illustrators develop them a piece of artwork or an insignia for their unit, that he actually would authorize that work to be done by Disney illustrators.
Oh yeah, and they did a lot of them. Hank Porter did the Flying Tigers, the ABG insignia, and countless others. There's two great books on the subject that have lots of the Disney insignia artwork, and they're really a great thing to study and read, especially for a Disney fan who also loves World War II. And so this will go into paintings and cowlings. This was a cowling I did as a gift for Chris Henry. It was a surprise from his wife. She kind of let me do whatever. So at the time, Chris had just taken a job at EAA, and she was still in Indiana, so they had a lot of phone conversations. So I thought that was a good place to start in developing a special piece for them. So this is my initial sketch and the Miss You Much final artwork that I did. So my first step was to do the drawing and transferred it onto the cowling this time with a template. And I started blocking it.
Chad, this one wasn't wearing a fresh coat of paint underneath, so maybe it's a good opportunity to discuss surface prep.
Yeah, this one was dirty. It's a C-47 cowling, and I wanted to keep as much of the surface texture as I could. I didn't want to sand it or make it pretty. I wanted to really retain that life that it had had. I wanted to show the life that it had had when painting this art on it. So all I really did was degreased it and went to town. I have another one that I tried to polish. They're made of stainless steel, and it didn't polish up very well. It looks better than this one does for trying to be polished, but I'm saving that one for another project. If anybody's wanting one of these pieces, I have several cowlings for sale, actually.
Get your Christmas orders in now.
Right. I've got, the C-47 cowlings are pretty manageable. They're like 2 by 3 feet. I can build panels that are bigger, which we'll see later. And I also have some really massive C-97 cowlings that I can only fit one in my truck at a time. It's crazy how big they are. So here's adding in the white just to block that all out. Now just to give me a better surface to paint to. And blocking in the different colors. And on a piece like this, where I can afford to take my time, I will. I'll let the paint dry overnight and not come back to it till the next day, versus where you're painting on an aircraft, where you don't really have that luxury. You've got to plan where you're painting your colors and when you're painting your colors so that you can get it done in the specified amount of time. You can see my template hanging up on the cabinet there. Just a quick detail shot. Here's the finished piece. Chris drove down and picked it up. He was super excited. I know he's got it hanging in his living room now. That was a fun piece. I'm really proud of this one. And this is a panel that I did for a car show called the Shakedown in Wisconsin, and actually took place in its last year at EAA on the grounds there. But since it's a car show, I wanted to have a kind of a hot roddy theme, but still look, World War II-ish. So I've got my girl riding on top of a Ford flathead with the engines falling apart because her shakedown run's not going planned. That piece of skin is a piece that they got for me from Basler. So it's a skin from a DC-3. You can see it says "No Step" ghosted into the metal there, right by her head. And this piece we also made into 10 signs that they sold at the show. I have one of those sitting right next to me, in fact. And I actually saw one last year in the fly market for sale. I said, hey, I know what that is. I did that. So that was a fun conversation with that vendor. This is another piece I did for a client. He wanted his wife to be painted up as a pinup girl for their house. So I worked with him, did sketches, presented them, and this is where we ended up. And I made this panel. I actually learned to rivet on this panel. This was my first piece to ever rivet. I've done quite a lot of riveting since then. I rivet the trophies together for a racing series that we sponsor. But it's just another piece of the puzzle, being able to rivet, and a piece of connection to that past that's really important to me. It makes it fun. And this is a panel for aircraft panels. I mentioned I went to England to paint in their booth. They have the drinks panel that opens up as a bar, which you probably saw in the pictures. This one's just another static panel. But a gentleman saw me painting Night Fright at the show, and I was wearing my Yule Pub t-shirt that I designed for the Liberty Foundation, and he got all excited because he loved the story. And I immediately bought one and wanted me to paint Yule Pub. So they shipped it to me from England, and I drew it up based on the lettering that I drew up for the t-shirt art, and started painting it onto the panel. And there's the finished piece. He doesn't have it yet. It's been shipped back to England, but because of the virus, it's kind of in limbo right now, which I know he's okay with, but interesting times for sure. And that's it. Special thanks to you, Keegan, and the Military Aviation Museum, and Gary Austin, of course, for starting this. Too many people to thank. You guys can see it on the screen. Especially my wife, Libby, for understanding my obsession and passion for this stuff. And my dad, my uncle, for really getting me started in loving aviation. I don't think they anticipated that I'd go as crazy for it as I did, but here I am. And my mom for teaching me how to draw, working with me and helping me to get better, which led to me becoming a professional graphic designer, and which I never would have dreamed in a million years when I graduated college and got my first job that I would be doing this kind of work today. So fortunate and blessed to be able to work with the people that I work with and the organizations that I work with to do something that I love and I'm so passionate about. So
Well,
now,
Chad,
let's open up the questions.
I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to everyone in your life who allows you to continue this amazing art and this, personal journey that you're on to kind of recreate these pieces of World War II artwork and bring to life these incredible warbirds around the country. If it's okay with you, we'll go ahead and start rolling through some questions here.
Sure.
So we've got an interesting question here that relates to whether or not this was something uniquely American during World War II, or if we saw a lot of nose art on Commonwealth airplanes. I think maybe one quick answer to that is that the famous shark mouth on a P-40 actually originated with a British unit in North Africa. So there definitely was some use of this on Commonwealth airplanes, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, nose art wasn't limited to the United States. The RAF certainly had nose art, though not quite as much. And the shark mouth, I believe the RAF crews saw that first painted on a ME-110 that the Germans had and painted it on their airplane. And of course, the AVG saw it in a magazine and decided to do the same thing for them. A big popular one for the RAF was Jane. It's a pinup girl. She was a cartoon in the papers in England. And so she was not unlike the Milk Caniff mail call series in the United States, where she was a pinup girl there to kind of boost the morale for the servicemen and help them get through their daily life and combat missions and whatnot, and just to provide some humor. There's a Lancaster with Jane painted on it today, in fact. So yeah, and they have some pieces of it at the RAF Museum in England, which I got to go to this past fall. And I believe there's some surviving panels in a museum in Canada as well.
Yeah, I was just taking a quick crawl around the internet. I remember the collection being there in Canada, but couldn't remember exactly who held it. But it is a fantastic collection that rivals the CAF's collection, but exclusively features Commonwealth aircraft.
Right.
So we've got another question here. Nose art is more commonly associated with U.S. Army Air Force's bomber and fighter units. Have you got any thoughts or perhaps an explanation as to why it was less common on Navy and Marine Corps aircraft?
I think the Navy and the Marines had tighter regulations in that regard, but they certainly did have the nose art. Of course, we saw Hal Olsen in my presentation, who painted on the Navy PB-4Ys. There was a case of a Lockheed Ventura that had the octopus on the top turret, which is really awesome. There's some Corsairs and Hellcats that had it. Sometimes they would even just take the Esquire pinup of the Varga or the Petty Girl and just dope them, cut them out and dope them right onto the plane, not even paint it. So yeah, they did have nose art. It's more rare, but they did have it.
Nose art wasn't necessarily officially sanctioned at all times. It did, in a lot of cases, come down to the feelings of individual base commanders who would often go to bat for the men, basically addressing nose art as an important part of giving their men a morale or psychological edge in battle. So it's often been said that Navy commanders and Navy units were stationed a lot closer to more senior officers who didn't necessarily take as high a view of nose art it's often provided as a reason why there might not have been as much on Navy airplanes as there was on Army aircraft. Chad, another question we've got here relates to understanding and interpreting color from black and white images. Can you maybe talk a little bit about when there's no color image available, how do you approximate what colors are in use in a given piece of artwork?
That's a good question, and that's a really hard thing to do. Of course, Gary Velasco is the expert on that. He goes into it in his book, Fighting Colors, on how he's studied the different films. And the different films would interpret the color in different ways. So you can see the same plane where in one photo, the lettering looks very dark, but in another photo, it looks very light. So you kind of have to use your best guess based on other things in association with that. Like if it looks like it's a blonde and it's the same tone, you can kind of match that up. Or we know the serial numbers are yellow a lot of times, so you can kind of guess the tones based on that. But there is an art to that for sure. And Gary's definitely the master at that.
Okay, another question we've got here. Lots of airplanes tended to share the same names. Was that necessarily because they shared common crew, or did it have something to do with popular song titles and other kind of references being made repeatedly by different crews around the world?
Yeah, the latter for sure. There are a lot of them used as song titles, like Shoo Shoo Baby was a song. Cow Cow Boogie was a song. So you see a lot of song titles popping up, or popular expressions that everyone used back in the day, would pop up. So people would see that and, just do the same thing.
Is there a type of airplane that you'd like to work on and haven't yet had the opportunity to work on?
I'd like to do a P-51. That's my favorite fighter. I'd love to be able to do the P-61, the Mid-Atlantic Museum when it's done. B-29 would be cool. Another B-24. I haven't done a B-25 yet. Pretty much, I guess the short answer is no. All of them.
I think that's the answer any true aviation enthusiast would give, which is all of them. Can you talk a little bit about Axis nose art, a little more perhaps than the original kind of reference made to the ME-110?
Yeah, I'm not as versed in the Axis nose art. I know there were examples. There was a group of 110s that had a wasp on it over the whole nose, which is really cool. It kind of reminds me of some of the B-25 gunships. It's that big and that graphic. Adolf Galland on his ME-109 had a picture of Mickey Mouse. There were some of the Germans on the F-190s had small pieces of artwork. The one group had the kind of stylized falcon across the whole nose. That's all I can think of off the top of my head.
I think Axis airplanes are interesting because a lot of times you find the personalization and artwork further back on the airframe. There was a lot of instances of it occurring on the tail where they tended to keep their kill markings on the tail as well,
Right.
or directly under the cockpit, kind of as a lucky symbol or talisman to kind of place your hand against before boarding the aircraft. So I think they, by nature of the different shape of their airplanes, they really didn't have necessarily the same amount of canvas to work with as American aviators and their nose art paintbrushes.
Yeah, the American planes were definitely bigger. You can really see that if you get them side by side sometime in some of the various museums. The Imperial War Museum in London has a rudder from a German Luftwaffe pilot. I don't recall his name, but he's got like 110 kills painted on the tail. And it's just amazing to see it in person that it survived. It's pretty cool.
Well, Chad, with that said, a couple of the questions have started to turn towards thanking you for your time this evening. And I have to say it's about that time for us here at the museum as well. So we wanted to just thank you so much again for the time you spent with us this evening. I know we have run a little longer than we have traditionally run these presentations, but I think you'll all agree that it was absolutely fantastic to have this window into Chad's journey of understanding the nose art and then finding ways to replicate it and share it with others. Chad, before we go, just one quick question. What is it like to have a veteran work with you to create some of these pieces of artwork? You mentioned both your dad and your uncle, participating and helping you with that particular C-47. Can you maybe relate some of the emotions that you feel as an artist having actual servicemen there with you?
Oh, it's special for sure. I think too hard about it. I usually get misty-eyed, but I'm really thankful to be able to do that and to share that with them. And Dad didn't talk about Vietnam a whole lot when I was a kid, but I'd look through his slides, and every now and then at an air show he'd share something. And my Uncle Bob didn't really talk too much about it either. But when we were at the C-47, he told me how he would polish the hubs on the B-25 so they could see the landing gear come up. And he told me about when they went down in Korea, how they flew above the 38th parallel. So, I mean, the veterans are why we do all of this, right? To really honor them and to share the history and to preserve the history. And I've gotten to meet a handful of the veterans of World War II, and it's just super special. Bud Anderson. I've done work with Bud Anderson. I met the last couple of surviving AVG guys down at Warbirds in Atlanta, and it's to be able to hear those stories and relate them firsthand is priceless. We're not going to be able to do that for much longer, which is a shame. Which makes it that much more important that we continue to restore these aircraft and fly them when we can, and paint them with the nose art and tell their stories so that our kids understand and know about it.
Yeah, I think in some small way, part of their humanity lives on through the artwork that you recreate and through the airplanes that we fly. So thank you again, Chad. We really appreciate it. We look forward to hosting you down here at the museum for an in-person visit when it is safe to do so. But in the meantime, folks, thank you again for joining us for this evening's webinar. Do check out Django Studios online. The link is in the chat panel. And if you're interested in supporting more free content like this webinar, feel free to make a contribution to the Military Aviation Museum. It is much appreciated at this time of great need. So have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.